Thank you, John, and thank you for having me. Greetings from Sacramento, California. John had mentioned that you have beautiful weather up in Oregon today, and I think it'll be about 80, 81 here today. So we'll get you done at 11 o'clock. But as John said, our project works, across the country, specifically in California, in working with districts to provide inclusive opportunities for students with disabilities. But we do take on a systems approach in working with our grantees across the state on building, implementing, sustaining, monitoring, and scaling up of the evidence-based inclusive practices. So if you have questions, I know we just have 45 minutes to an hour, but if you have questions or would like to know more about the project, you can access resources, further information from www.cipinclusion.org. And then you can also like us or friend us on Facebook and Twitter at CipInclusion, where we share tons of resources. And I'll talk about some of the resources that we have available at no cost. To anyone in California, I've also opened up registration to any of our free webinars that you can attend in Oregon. So with that, I would just wanted to talk a little bit about today's outcome. There was only one, since we have a short amount of time today. Hopefully by the end of this presentation, you will deepen your knowledge and perspective of inclusion and inclusive practices as they relate to equity, access, and outcomes of all students. And this is typically the place that we start when we're working with our districts, is we're really looking at that mindset and the culture that guides the policies and the practices that are part of our system, which could provide equity, but also could be from a source of ableist perspectives. So we help our districts first to change their mindsets around what could be. What are the possibilities for all of the students within the system? So we also start with looking at vision and mission. And I love the Oregon response to instruction and intervention, vision and mission. I'll give you a second to read them. But where I really connected is that their mission is to build and sustain from a perspective of prevention and support. And that connected to me because it's that MTSS perspective, and it's also that UDL perspective. It's the perspective of proactive design of environments so that students are provided access and equity. It's not about the students' disabilities from a deficit perspective, but it's the disability that's within our system and our educational environment. So that's going to be our context for the presentation today. And as John had mentioned in the title, it's really presuming competence. And the question being, do we approach our policies, our practices, and our mindsets from a presumption of competence perspective, an asset-based perspective, in designing our educational plans, our IEPs, with that asset-based perspective, in shifting our thinking from where are the deficits within the students to where are the deficits in our educational system. So one of the resources, and I'm happy to put this in the Google folder, is Shelley Moore. If you're not familiar with Shelley Moore, it is the first thing I would do after this webinar is go to her website, which is 5 More Minutes, and she releases really short, informative videos related to inclusion. And the one, it's not the latest, but I think it was released February 1st. It's presuming competence. And she speaks very specifically about the primary barrier of inclusion, effective and meaningful inclusion, being the adult mindset within the system. It doesn't cost money to change, but it is the most difficult to shift organizationally. And this is really that starting point in creating inclusive environments within an entire organization. So when we talk about the how, when we talk about the what and the where, it encompasses the culture, it encompasses the presumption of competence by all adults within that system. And I have a story. This is Beth and Patrick Foraker. And just to set the stage for this next hour, um, Beth is a teacher supervisor at University of California at Davis, which is about 12 miles outside of Sacramento. And in the picture with her is her son, Patrick. And as you can see, Patrick has Down syndrome. And from his preschool years, Patrick had been educated in an inclusive environment from preschool through elementary school, through high school, and it resulted in a diploma after high school. And Beth talks about her experiences with the soft bigotry of low expectations. And by soft bigotry, what she's getting at is this idea of implicit bias. We don't even know that the decisions that sometimes we make, the policies that we create within the system are actually detrimental in the long run. So this idea of early segregation doesn't predict later segregation, it almost ensures it. So she lived by that to ensure that Patrick was in an inclusive environment and that all adults that were part of his team throughout his educational career had that same mindset. And I think the most important part of this story is where Patrick is now, which is at the end of his sophomore year in a college program, a 4-year college residential program, living independently on the East Coast at George Mason University. And a critical part of this story is that Patrick had always voiced his desire to be part of an education that involved becoming a movie director. So when we talk about self-determination in our system, when we talk about self-advocacy, that has to start so early. And if we don't share how students learn in particular environments with students, they're not able to self-advocate. They're not able to voice or understand who they are and what they want out of life. So UDL talks a lot about voice and choice, giving students voice and giving them choice so that they learn what they need to be successful, and they also experience failure. And because Patrick was able to navigate relationships with his typically developing peers, arguments, deal with unpredictability, those are all the skills that have enabled him to be successful in a 4-year residential college program. And if we don't plan for students with intellectual or developmental disabilities for what is possible, if we don't know that there are at least 16 colleges and universities that provide 4-year college experiences for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, then we're not creating our educational plans, our educational environments to make that a reality for all of our students. And I just love the idea that no studies conducted since the late 1970s have shown an academic advantage for students with intellectual or other developmental disabilities educated in separate settings. Now, the caveat with that is that when students with disabilities are placed in general education settings, there has to be a system, a structure, and supports so that they are meaningfully included, not just placed in that general education setting without the plan. So when we go back to this how question, how does inclusion happen effectively? That's why we start with that envisioning phase before we build, before we implement. And it has to be a systemic approach as opposed to classroom by classroom or district by district or school by school. So if we don't know that the possibility of a 4-year college program for our students who in most cases are in segregated environments, we have to ask the question, are the segregated environments preparing all students for the possibility of going to college or going into careers and teaching them the skills necessary, the social emotional, the relational skills, as well as the academic skills. And just as a side note, the University of California at Davis will be opening up their first 4-year college program on the West Coast in the United States. So just something to think about, and it's called the Redwood Seeds program. If you want to look it up, we're just now starting to work with the mentors who will be working with the new students in the first cohort. So let's get involved. So what would that mean for you? If you had to choose one adjective that, in your opinion, was the #1 quality of a student who is college, career, and civic life ready, what would that be? And if you would enter that in the chat, I will pull it up and see if we can get some interactions in the chat. Employable, Bill, I love that. Resilient. Shelby, good one. I think mine is self-advocacy. How to self-advocate for oneself. Yes, Valentina, we're on the same page. Self-advocacy. Because if we don't talk about students and give them the opportunity to experience success and failure, what we don't talk about in our society turns to shame and turns to questioning. And then we don't push students to obtain those skills necessary. Lifelong learner, resourceful, flexible. Progress isn't always linear. We're going to talk about the jagged line of learner profiles, which is also a UDL, a Universal Design for Learning perspective. Confident. Bill, you have a lot of them, good ones. Goal-oriented, love it. So, and I've done this activity in person, on Zoom, and there's one adjective that I have never received. Can anybody guess what that was or isn't? Enter in the chat if you can think about what that one adjective is. Smart, Gianna. Yeah, smart, or I've never had academically proficient. And when we think about students and what the potential barriers are for students to be in a general education setting effectively, it's sometimes around that academic. They're not academically ready. Is it that the students aren't academically ready, or the environment hasn't been set in such a way that it's ready to receive students who learn differently? And that's that mind shift from the student deficits to the environmental deficits as the barriers to mitigate. So that's the idea of expert learners. So the goal of Universal Design for Learning is developing expert learners. And the definition that CAST, where all things UDL originate, have defined within their UDL principles of engagement, representation, and action and expression, the characteristics or descriptors of an expert learner. And when you look at these descriptors, these are the characteristics that we're hoping to instill in all of our students. And Beth will tell the story about Patrick texting her and saying, "Hey, Mom, can you put money in my account?" And she did. And she's like, "How are things?" And then she never hears a response back. And she's like, "Yep, he's a typical kid." Or getting a FaceTime a call from Patrick and saying, "Hey, Mom, guess where I am? I'm in the back seat of an Uber that I called with my friends going to a Super Bowl game." Those are the experience that, beyond his inclusion in a college program, that Beth is like, you know what? These are the characteristics that we need to instill, and the experiences that students in our pre-K to 22 system have to experience. If they don't experience these, these connections with their typically developing peers, and they leave our system having been segregated, and then we expect the students to be able to somehow develop those skills when they are now trying to move into a college or career situation based on their desires. So I would highly recommend that if you're not familiar with Universal Design for Learning, it's one of the what things. With UDL, it's an inclusive practice that really addresses not only academic equity and access, but also social emotional. We have a number of webinars by experts that you can register for, or you can obtain the recorded webinars by Katie Novak, who's really the queen of all things Universal Design for Learning. And then upcoming, we have contracted with Tisha Fitzgerald, and she's going to be working with districts over the course of 4 webinars on anti-racism and Universal Design for Learning. So if you want to know more, you can visit our website, or you can visit cast.org, which there's just so much great information to work with on their website. So what is inclusion? You know, we've talked a little bit about the how, we've talked a little bit about the where, but we really have to be clear on what our personal and organizational definition of inclusion. And if we're not clear on that, then we can't communicate that through the system, as well as our community stakeholders, our families, as well as the students, and making sure that students have a place where they feel belonging, community, and relationships. So inclusion is educational equity and access. It's not dump and hope. And I've been in too many meetings where, oh, we've got to move this student into a general education setting or a less restrictive setting, but then the supports and the services and the relationships within that place aren't ready for the student when they arrive. And that's not meaningful inclusion. There's that sense of belonging, the sense of community. The student's not a visitor in the classroom who comes and goes, but the students feel a sense of community, and the student feels a sense of community with typically developing peers, as well as the adults in that place. And having started my educational career many, many years ago as a paraeducator, I was put in too many situations where I was working with a student. I didn't know the student. I didn't understand the disability, how the disability presented itself. And this is part of a systemic approach, making sure that we have trainings for our paraeducators on what their role and responsibilities are, as well as specifics around the needs of that student. And then just one more plug for our webinars. In April and May, Katie Novak is coming back. And she's presenting as part of our webinar series for paraeducators that's been going on all year. So if you're interested in the previous recordings that you can utilize in your school or your district to train paraeducators, I'm happy to send out the link, and you can have all of the resources and recordings. It's educational benefit. Inclusion is meaningful in terms of benefiting all students, not just mainstreaming. And with mainstreaming, it's that visitor idea where students are coming into a setting, they're coming into a place, but then they're also leaving. So that takes us back up to, there's a lack of community and belonging. So how can we create environments where students are included as opposed to mainstreamed in, and always working toward a less restrictive environment? It's about independence and interdependence. And that's Patrick. Patrick is completely independent in his self-determination and what he wants out of his life. And he's interdependent. He's interdependent on the system. He knows what supports he needs, and he's able to ask for them. And we'll talk a little bit about line of sight inclusion. How many students see what's happening, but not participating in what's happening in benefit to all students? And it's a philosophy that all students can learn. It's the mindset, which is the biggest barrier, why we work with our districts first on culture, then the identification of policies and practices from an ableist perspective, and identifying ableist decisions that have been made in the past. Not just for compliance and meeting our targets, it's breaking down those silos that we're all so familiar with and experience as adults in the system that don't benefit students. And it's not this idea of mine versus yours. This is my student. These are the students that I'm responsible for, and those are your students that you're responsible for. So just keeping really clear, what is our definition of inclusion? And I'm going to give you a little bit of time. I want to give you a little bit of time to work in breakout rooms. We'll take 4 minutes for you to have a discussion. What is your definition of inclusion? You can also talk about what is your experience with inclusion. Could be both positive, it could be negative, or just middle of the road. But would love to have for you 4 minutes to have those conversations, about 4 people in each of the breakout rooms. And then when you come back for that 5th minute, I'd like you to put your definition of inclusion in the chat. And we'll just do a quick waterfall as people enter back into the main room. So John's going to give us 4 minutes. Breakout rooms. Any questions before we go? All right. Oh, so I wanted to say thanks to Don and Ellen, who are in my breakout room. We had a great conversation about not only their definition, but their experience, and how moving from one district that's inclusive into another district, Dan's experience was, not as inclusive. So, it's just a difference among philosophies and supports and services and resources that we're providing in terms of equity and access. And Ellen's experience of co-teaching as an inclusive practice. So I appreciate your thoughts. And in the chat, if you would just cascade or waterfall your definition of inclusion, either through the conversation that you just had or one that you brought with you. So I'll give you a minute to enter. Meaningful participation. Inclusion is all students being able to be who they are and thrive in education. Community. Thanks, Cameron. Others. A team, that team approach. Yes, Elizabeth. Leadership team approach. And one of the other critical pieces to this is that before the users, before the students experience an inclusive innovation, the system has to be in place. Yes, Jen, the system and supports have to be in place, because if it's not successful, then we create a mindset that inclusion doesn't work. And we blame the students or the idea of inclusion, as opposed to continually reframing the environment such that it is providing access and equity. What we want to talk about is often not the reality due to resources, training, and system support. Yes, Marley. Each system is getting the needs met in the manner they need with their contribution. Excellent. Individual. Yeah, so if everyone can see Gianna's response, and we talked about inclusion being individual instead of blanketed in terms of disability category or IQ. Yeah, and part of what you'll hear if you go to Shelley Moore is that when you design for the margins, all benefit. So when we create an IEP, there are accommodations and modifications that other students within that general education setting would benefit from, who are also struggling. Students being active members of a classroom. Educators and paraprofessionals need training and support. Yes, training and support has to happen ongoing, as well as prior to students, individual students, or a holistic inclusion project moving forward. That training of paraprofessionals, related service staff, general education teachers, and special education teachers, really understanding the purpose in how inclusion impacts positively students post-secondary. So thank you all for participating in that. I love the participation in the chat. So I have a couple of slides, and I'm going to hold the slides up for 30 seconds each. And I just want you to process and ask yourself the question, is this screenshot a visual representation of inclusion? So here's the first. Feel free to enter in the chat if you like. So we've been talking about equity. Does this describe an equitable participation or equitable inclusive opportunities? Inclusion, yes, but not equity. And in that third image, all three students, they were provided accommodations based on equity and what their needs are. But now they can see the game without any support. So if the goal is for students to see, that's this line of sight inclusion. The question is whether or not there is meaningful participation. Wesley brought up this image in a college course one time, and I was told that it was not equity, but inclusion, if I remember right. So let's take a different approach in the second photo and see if you can identify the difference between the two images. Good response, Jenna. So we have equality, where everyone gets the same. We have equity, where students receive what they need. And then we have liberation, where the barrier is removed. We don't have a fence at all. But when we're talking about inclusion, now the students are participating. They've been invited, there's belonging, there's community, and there's relationships. So this is where we're moving, and we have to be able to identify any ableist decisions or barriers that we need to mitigate to get us to that fourth picture. So I hope that was helpful, because I see that first image all the time. And every time I see it, I'm like, that's just not inclusion. It's not what we're talking about. So this idea of creating places for students to experience their education in a frame of belonging, community, and relationships. Students are constantly, just like adults, are assessing environments as to whether or not they're safe or whether or not they're threatening. And if they don't feel a part of an environment, or if they feel that they are, in the corner working with an adult, or they don't know themselves within that environment because the instruction hasn't been designed for access and equity, well, then their ability for cognition lessens because their emotions are heightened. So ensuring that all of our environments are as much as possible free of bullying, free of this idea of segregation, so that when we have that idea of safe, inclusive, belonging, community environments, students' ability to learn is increased. They're willing to make mistakes. They're willing to interact at much different levels with their typically developing peers. So I was at a conference in Southern California about 2 years ago, and they had a student panel. It was an equity conference. It was a student panel of elementary, middle, and high schools, and the students had, a variety of identities across the stage, and there were probably 1,200 educators in the audience. And the moderator asked the question, if you could say anything to the educators in the audience, the educators that you benefited from in the past in your educational setting, what would you want to say to them? So when we talk about universal design for learning, there's this idea of student voice, asking the students, what do you need? Asking the students, how are you interacting with the environment that I've created as an adult? So when we think of universal design for learning, it's not just about the principles or proactive lesson design, it's student voice, student choice, so that they can see themselves represented in the environment. And this is what the students all said. And I was feverishly writing as each one spoke. So I'll let you read these to yourselves as I page through. So as you can imagine, after the students all spoke, there, first of all, wasn't a dry eye in the entire auditorium, but also the level of self-reflection that was happening among the educators in the room, thinking, you know, this is really what we need to hear and who we need to hear from. That if we don't ask the end users, the students and the families that we're creating these systems for, what is their experience and how might we improve what we're doing, then we're only acting on our own assumptions. And if our presumption of competence then isn't in place, then we may be creating environments that are not reflective of our students and family, and therefore a disconnect between what they need to know and what they're learning. So the question becomes, can all students see themselves and their stories reflected in our work, the work of creating those inclusive environments? If students aren't connected to those educational environments, this is a huge barrier that if they don't feel a part of or community with the adults and the students that they experience, then your inclusive opportunities, your inclusive systems, your inclusive structures will not be as beneficial as you would have hoped. So we have to really look a bit deeper. If we are grouping students with disabilities, for example, as one homogeneous group and not providing those supports in an individualized way through an IEP, for example, and if we don't break students' identity down into specifics and understand that our educational system has been designed to benefit certain groups of students and others not availed of accessible instruction, then we're not able to get to the depth of creating those supports and structures that result in equity and access. So let's take it a step further, and our work has backed up a bit. It's not only about students with disabilities, it's also about disproportionate representation of students of certain groups within special education, and asking that question, what is the overrepresentation of students of marginalized race, marginalized gender, sexual orientation, and how do all of those various identities impact the system that result in overrepresentation? And just as the slide prior mentioned, it's the adult self-reflection, it's the adult identification of potential implicit bias within the system that moves students with disabilities into segregated environments, as well as overrepresentation of marginalized student populations. So in this quote, it's an oldie but goodie. I take it everywhere I go, but it's the idea of eliminating educational barriers. And we have to look at gender and race, ethnicity, national origin, color, disability, age. And when we look at those various identities, it's not about looking at, it's reflecting on our implicit bias or potential implicit bias that creates ableist structures. So I hope where we're going with this in really pulling back the layers of the onion, that it's not about inclusion specifically, but looking at the adults who create the system that's either inclusive or segregated for certain student populations. So in doing that, we have to recognize, honor, and celebrate the variability of learners. So every student has a jagged learning profile. There is no average. So in our educational system, if we are designing for the average, we're not designing for anyone. And that's a key perspective. Todd Rose does an amazing TED Talk, and he also wrote the book, The Myth of Average, that there is no average. So therefore, it's a myth, and we're designing for absolutely no students. We are also living by this idea that segregated environments, students who are experiencing segregated environments for their educational history, have very little to offer. That their strengths aren't honored, their strengths aren't celebrated. And imagine what that is what that is like for a student to experience throughout their day, weeks, years. So in universal design for learning, if we know that there is variability of learners in our system, we know that it's systematic, we know that it's predictable, and if it's predictable, we can plan for it. We can proactively plan our environments, plan our curriculum, plan our instruction to ensure that the variability of learners across the continuum are access and equitable in our instruction. So, and learner capacities are context dependent. In certain contexts, we're all really good at things. And in other contexts, we may need a level of support as adults. And the same is true for our students. So let's do a quick polling activity. You'll see 4 stages across the screen. Stage 1 is unable to perform the task. Stage 2 is you're able to perform the task, but you need assistance. Stage 3, you're able to perform the task independently, but not proficient. And stage 4, you're proficient at performing the task independently. So I'm going to put up 3 tasks, and I want you to rate yourself on the poll that John's going to bring up. Are you at a stage 1, 2, 3, or 4? Okay, so here's your first task. Solving a calculus problem. Are you stage 1? First one, we've got a stage 1. That's where I would be. If there was a -10, I think I would be at a -10 on this one. We have a stage 4. So this is demonstrative of our variability of those on this call, on this webinar. So we have a continuum of unable to perform the task all the way up to proficient at performing the task. If we know that our students are going to be across that continuum, then we can plan the supports, the services, the accommodations, the modifications to ensure that all students are experiencing an education at their level. So let's change the task. Let's change the context. So the second task is, where would you be? What stage if you were figure skating? Yeah, it looks like calculus problem. It was almost half of us were at stage 1. So figure skating. Stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, or stage 4? Ooh, I want to know more about the stage 4. Wesley would be stage 20, -20. Yeah, I'm with you on that one, Wesley. So when we change the context, just like we change different environments throughout the day, we experience success, we experience failure. And again, you've got a lot at stage 1, a couple at stage 2. For me, I would be with Wesley at -20 on solving a calculus problem, but figure skating, because of my experience, because of my interest, I would be at probably a stage +20, having been a competitive ice skater for about 12 years. So when I change the context, I am responding to my environment in a different way in terms of success and failure. So, yep, looks like 59% with our figure skating. And then let's look at the third task. Third task is make sushi. Oh, looks like it's changed just a little bit. Now we've got most at stage 3. You can perform the task independently, but not proficient. Yeah, I don't think I could do it independently. It wouldn't look quite like sushi. And it's based on our experience, possibly our culture, our interest, whether or not we like the food that we're creating. So all kinds of factors influence how we perform in particular settings, in particular environments. So this is that idea of variability of learners and moving away from who belongs and who doesn't belong. Right. Thank you all for participating. So I mentioned Katie Novak. We've done a lot of contracting with Katie over the past couple years. And if you're interested, Novak Educational Consulting, amazing resources on her website. But these are her two kids, and we're going to watch a quick video. It's like 2 minutes, less than 2 minutes. And these are her two twins on either end, Brecken on the left and Aylin on the right, and then James is in the middle. And this is from one of our webinars, and Katie is up in the right-hand corner, and she's explaining their experience in being in inclusive environments. Here we go.
Brother, the bookend, and that's one of their best friend, James. And James has Fragile X syndrome, and he's almost completely nonverbal, and obviously, significantly developmentally delayed cognitively. And they're just the three best of friends. And the really cool thing about this story here is that, Aylin, from the first time she met him, she was like a warrior for James. And so when he was in first grade, when he gets really excited, he flaps his hands a little bit. And so he was running outside doing tag, and he was flapping his hands, and a bunch of little girls went up to him and said, "Why do you always do that with your hands?" And Aylin sees this across the playground, and she comes like busting across. And I hear this from a teacher who's my colleague. And she said, "Hey, ladies, if you're gonna mess with someone, you're gonna have to mess with me." And this is just like a little ball of fire. Now, I'll tell you something else about my daughter, Aylin, which is that she has severe combined type ADHD. And for all the amazing strengths and beauty and fire she brings into this world, she can also be really impulsive and dangerous and violent. And those are ways that you could describe her, but that's not her. She's just Aylin, and she brings all these amazing strengths to the classroom. And she also brings these amazing areas that she needs to work on. And so what's really beautiful about this picture to me is that Brecken is significantly above grade level, and James is significantly below grade level. And Aylin exhibits behaviors that most classroom teachers will never, ever want to see. But the three of them are in the same class together all day, every day, and they are challenged and they are supported equally because of universal design for learning. And in most places in this world, they would be separated. And they would be separated because there would be a belief that Brecken deserves more, that he deserves better, and that James can't do it, and that Aylin doesn't belong there because she can't behave. And what I will tell you is I will fight this fight until every parent of all of these kids gets to see that they belong together, that in this world, we all belong together. And when you separate them, what you're saying is that James and Aylin have nothing to offer Brecken, and they do. They all have equal amazing things to offer each other.
Absolutely one of my favorite short videos with an amazing message. And I don't want to put out in the universe that all students should be in a general education at all times, that there are still needs for students to receive specific individualized support, of course. But it goes back to that idea of relationship, community, and belonging. Is it a pullout? Is it a push-in? Is it a mainstream? The question is, are students feeling a part of that community with their typically developing peers so that they're able to experience those relationships, those arguments, repairing of relationships, unpredictability that may not be available in segregated settings? So we have to break down those barriers. And one of the places to start is the equity discussion. The equity discussion around implicit bias and identifying those ableist structures in our systems. And if we can't identify them, then we can't mitigate them. So this work has to start by increasing our awareness of identity and the way our identities intersect, which is referring to intersectionality, and the way they intersect vary by individual students and how then students present themselves in our educational settings based on their intersections of identities. So kind of a visual, because we get a lot of questions. Can you talk a little bit more about intersectionality and how that impacts students with disabilities? So imagine that circle is a student, and the students, every student, are at the intersection of many different identities that are coming up on the screen now. Their ethnicity, their sex, their gender, sexual orientation, etc. And all of these identities intersect in various ways. And because we're in an educational setting, we also have to understand the social construct of disability in our educational settings. So in too many cases, what happens to all of those identities that make up who a student is, when we pull out and identify and label disability, what happens to the other identities? And in too many cases, other identities fall away, and that student is then too often identified by their identity of deficit. And that intersection of identities then impact, going back to that idea of, is my environment safe? Does my environment include me? Am I in a situation where it's mine versus yours? And as a student, I don't feel as though I'm a responsibility of certain individuals in our setting. So generally, students qualifying for special ed services are defined by that singular identity based on a deficit model, based on what they can't do, and then trying to fix them before they're allowed into a setting that would be beneficial for all students. So, and we also get a lot of questions about ableism and what ableism is. And not only being able to identify the ableism in our system that limits opportunities for students with disabilities to be included in general education, less restrictive environments, we have to be able to identify, but then also mitigate. We have to be brave enough to actually call out ableism in our language, in our structures, in our policies, and our practices. And we can't do that if we don't have a culture or a mindset of equity, access, and inclusion. And just a couple examples of microaggressions that are from an ableist perspective. And really that idea of we have to fix kids is a foundational idea around ableism. We're not trying to fix kids. We're trying to honor kids and create environments in our educational system that allows for that access and equity. So what does that look like? Let's just all put it together here at the end. So I mentioned that soft bigotry of low expectations that really results in a cycle of failure for too many students. So we have a student who experiences marginalization, and this could be in our ORTIi process, as well as within our special education supports and structures. So the student experiences marginalization. There becomes a deficit view of that student once we have a label, and that student experiences lowered expectations. That's the soft bigotry of low expectations. We think we're doing well by the student by segregating them into environments with like peers. And then labeling and placement in remedial learning environments, lowering of those standards, and then the remedial learning perpetuates that school failure. And that is where early segregation, it ensures later expectation. And if students are going to leave our system in segregated environments, and then the expectation is that they'll be successful in college and career, it's not going to happen. And this cycle happens for too many students again and again and again. So starting with understanding that we're all humans, we all have our own experiences, but really looking and observing ourselves and reflecting on our own identities, as well as our response to marginalized identities or identities different from our own, and how that influences segregated environments or a lack of access and equity. And then broadening our culture experiences and knowledge. This allows students to see themselves reflected when the adults in the system understand who they are. Grounding ourselves in a definition of equity and just lean into the work. So I would like to leave you with a task. So based on the Oregon Response to Instruction and Intervention mission and vision statements that we talked about at the beginning, what commitment have you made or will you make toward the realization of an educational system focused on inclusion, equity, and access? And I gave you a little example, and I'm going to give you about a minute to think about it, and then give you an opportunity to place in the chat what your commitment to creating inclusive, equitable, accessible environments are. And then we'll have questions. Let's start. There we go. I see a 2. I commit to building awareness and education around inclusion, training and where needed, and support where needed. Thank you, Caitlin. Jen. Refocusing deficit thinking to asset-based thinking. Ooh, push my staff. Thank you, Beth. I just love the start. Push my staff. I could end reading right there. To think and talk about students' abilities. Liz, I commit to continually learning more. Thanks, John. And I just wanted to thank everybody who tuned in and participated. And I hope you were able to maybe take away a little new learning around inclusion. And my email is on the, I think, second or third slide, that if you have questions or if you need assistance in registering for any of our webinars or would like any resources, I'm happy to send those out. The one thing that I did want to say before I left is Shelley Moore, who I mentioned earlier, she actually has a 9-session webinar series that's currently happening, and it's all around inclusive, competency-based IEPs, which I'm completely obsessed with. So if you go to Eventbrite and just look up Shelley Moore, you can access the recordings. I think they're really cheap, around $16 each. And she's on, I think, number 5. So I've really downloaded all of the recordings, and it is mind-blowing. So just a little resource, but I appreciate everyone's attendance and participation. And John, I didn't know if there was any questions that anybody wanted to answer or take themselves off mute. I'm happy to chat.